June 7th, 1942. Dawn breaks over the Admiralty Building in Whitehall, London. The stone corridors still hold the chill of night, and through the tall Georgian windows, pale sunlight filters across mahogany desks buried beneath stacks of intelligence reports, naval charts, and decoded intercepts. In the underground operations room, a single teletype machine begins its mechanical chatter, a sound that has become the heartbeat of Britain's war effort. The keys strike with urgent rhythm, printing black letters onto cream-colored paper, each character carrying weight across an ocean. The duty officer, a young lieutenant commander whose uniform bears the wear of countless sleepless nights, tears the paper free with hands that have learned not to tremble at bad news. But as his eyes move across the words transmitted from Pearl Harbor via Washington, something unprecedented happens. His breath catches, not from dread, from disbelief. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers destroyed. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, names that had been spoken in British naval circles with a mixture of professional respect and profound anxiety. All gone, sent to the bottom of the Pacific in a single day of combat. The lieutenant commander reads the message twice, then a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more comprehensible. Around him, the operations room continues its perpetual hum of activity, but he stands motionless, holding a piece of paper that has just rewritten the mathematics of the entire Pacific War. For 28 months, since that September dawn when German tanks rolled into Poland, the British Empire has stood as democracy's last fortress in Europe, bleeding from 1,000 wounds, watching ally after ally fall, learning to measure hope in tablespoons rather than cups. And now, this impossible thing typed on a teletype ribbon. The Americans, those late-arriving cousins who entered the war only 6 months ago, have achieved in 72 hours what Britain's Royal Navy could not accomplish in years in Mediterranean combat: the complete destruction of a major enemy carrier force. He walks the message up 2 flights of stairs, his footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn quiet, to where the First Sea Lord maintains his office. The news will travel upward through the chain of command, like a flame following a fuse, from the Admiralty to the War Cabinet, from military leadership to Churchill himself. But in this moment, in the silence of those stone stairs, the lieutenant commander allows himself something British officers rarely permit: a smile. Not of triumph. Britain has fought too long to confuse a single victory with final triumph, but of relief, profound, shoulder-sagging relief. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese southward advance has not just been slowed, it has been stopped, broken, reversed. The British Empire has spent 2.5 years learning bitter lessons about modern warfare. In Norway, British and French forces discovered that control of the air meant control of the sea. At Dunkirk, they learned that courage and small boats could rescue an army, but not erase a defeat. Through the fall of France, the agony of the Blitz, and the desperate struggle in North Africa, British planners absorbed the cruel mathematics of industrial war, that production capacity matters, that logistics decides battles, that even the finest training and bravest hearts cannot overcome a deficit in ships, planes, and steel. When Japan entered the war in December 1941, British strategic calculations became even grimmer. The attack on Pearl Harbor was followed within days by the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off Malaya, Britain's 2 most powerful capital ships in Asian waters, sent to the bottom of Japanese aircraft in under 2 hours. Then came the fall of Singapore, the greatest capitulation in British military history, when 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered to a smaller Japanese force. each defeat taught the same lesson. Japan possessed carriers, trained pilots, and naval aviation doctrine that had evolved beyond anything Britain could match in the Pacific. The British Eastern Fleet, already stripped to support Mediterranean operations, could not contest Japanese control of Southeast Asian waters. India seemed vulnerable. Australia appeared isolated. The entire architecture of British imperial defense in Asia, built over centuries, had collapsed in 4 months. British planners watching this catastrophe understood they were witnessing not just military defeat, but a fundamental shift in global power. The Royal Navy, which had ruled the waves for 300 years, could not save Singapore, could not hold the Dutch East Indies, could not even adequately protect the Indian Ocean without American assistance. Britain's ability to shape events in the Pacific had become marginal. The empire that had painted a quarter of the world's map pink now depended utterly on American industrial power and American naval strength to prevent Japanese domination of half the globe. This dependence created profound psychological complexity in British leadership. Gratitude mixed with resentment, relief mixed with wounded pride. Britain needed America, needed American factories, American ships, American soldiers, but needing and wanting are different emotional experiences. Churchill had courted American intervention for 2 years before Pearl Harbor, understanding that Britain alone could not defeat Germany. But when America finally entered the war, it arrived not as Britain's junior partner, but as a power whose industrial capacity dwarfed Britain's entire production capacity. American shipyards were already launching vessels at rates that made British production look artisanal. American aircraft factories operated at scales that transformed air power from a tactical tool into a strategic hammer. The Americans brought wealth, resources, and industrial might that Britain had exhausted in 2 years of lonely fighting. They also brought a certain brashness, a confidence unmarked by defeat, an assumption that American methods and American energy could solve problems that had stymied older military establishments. British officers, schooled in traditions reaching back to Nelson, found American naval practice sometimes baffling, occasionally frustrating, often refreshingly direct. The Americans had lost badly at Pearl Harbor, but responded not with despair, but with furious energy. Within weeks, American carriers were raiding Japanese-held islands. Within months, American industrial planning had begun the largest naval construction program in human history. The Americans possessed something Britain had spent: youth. Not chronological youth, but psychological youth. The belief that defeats were temporary, that problems had solutions, that sufficient energy and resources could overcome any obstacle. British planners, exhausted by years of fighting on minimal resources, watched this American vigor with mixed feelings. It seemed simultaneously naive and enviable, unsophisticated and potentially decisive. When news reached London in early May 1942 that American and Japanese carrier forces had fought in the Coral Sea, British analysts studied the reports with intense professional interest. The battle had been tactically ambiguous. Both sides lost carriers, both claimed victory, neither achieved decisive advantage. But strategically, the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby had been turned back. For the first time in the Pacific War, a Japanese offensive had been stopped before achieving its objective. The Americans had traded roughly even in ships, but had prevented Japanese expansion toward Australia. British planners recognized this as significant, but not transformative. One checked advance did not reverse the strategic balance. The Japanese still held the initiative, still possessed more operational carriers than the Americans could field, still threatened multiple axes of advance across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Then came early June, and fragmentary intelligence suggesting major Japanese naval movements.
British cryptographers at Bletchley Park, who had achieved remarkable success against German naval codes, had less insight into Japanese communications. Most Pacific intelligence came through American channels, and in early June, those channels went partially quiet, an operational security measure that left British planners reading tea leaves. What they knew came in pieces. Japanese radio traffic had surged, then gone silent in patterns suggesting fleet movements. American carriers had sorted from Pearl Harbor. Something significant was happening near Midway Island, an American outpost in the Central Pacific that most British officers needed maps to locate. The strategic significance of Midway itself seemed modest, a tiny atoll with an airstrip closer to Japan than to any major American base. But its loss would open approaches to Hawaii and further isolate America's position in the Pacific. Japanese planners apparently believed that threatening Midway would force the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where superior Japanese numbers could destroy America's remaining carriers. It was sound strategic logic, the kind of operation that had worked repeatedly for Japan since Pearl Harbor. British planners, following the fragmentary reports, expected another American defeat. Not from defeatism, but from arithmetic. The Japanese had more carriers, more experience, more veteran pilots. The Americans had courage, but lacked the weight of numbers to prevail in a carrier battle against Japan's combined fleet. Then came that teletype message on June 7th, and arithmetic dissolved into something inexplicable. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. 1 American carrier lost, the Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, hastily repaired and sent back into action within days. The kill ratio seemed impossible. Carrier battles were supposed to be mutual bloodletting, both sides savaging each other until one withdrew. This was something different. This was annihilation. As fuller reports arrived through the day, transmitted from American sources, cross-checked against Japanese radio traffic, analyzed by British naval intelligence, the scope of the victory became clearer and more remarkable. The Japanese had lost not just 4 carriers, but the core of their carrier aviation expertise. Hundreds of trained pilots, irreplaceable veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, decades of institutional knowledge sent to the bottom in a single afternoon. The Americans had achieved this through a combination of factors: cryptographic intelligence that revealed Japanese plans, tactical audacity that risked everything on a coordinated strike, and extraordinary luck when American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers at the precise moment those ships were most vulnerable. Fueled aircraft on deck, ordnance scattered, fuel lines open. British naval officers reading these reports experienced cognitive dissonance. The Americans were supposed to be learning this business, absorbing hard lessons, gradually building competence through bloody experience. Instead, they had executed one of the most devastating naval victories in history, while still essentially novices at carrier warfare. How? British analysts began comparing Midway to historical analogues: Trafalgar, Tsushima, battles where one side achieved disproportionate victory through superior tactics, training, or fortune. But those battles had involved established naval powers at the height of their expertise. Midway had been won by a navy that 6 months earlier had been surprised in port and mauled at Pearl Harbor. What kind of nation absorbed that kind of blow and 6 months later destroyed the enemy's primary striking force? The answer that began forming in British strategic thinking was uncomfortable and illuminating. A nation with resources so vast that even catastrophic losses were temporary setbacks. America had won at Midway not simply through better tactics or braver pilots, though both played roles. America won because it could afford to take risks that would be existential for Britain. The Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, was repaired in 72 hours at Pearl Harbor and sent back into battle with still bearing jury-rigged repairs. British shipyards, working at capacity, could not match that speed. American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes deeply enough to predict enemy movements. American industry was simultaneously repairing damaged ships and constructing new ones at rates that made losses replaceable. The Americans fought with an abundance that Britain had not possessed since 1939. British military leadership had spent 2 years making agonizing calculations about risk. How many hurricanes could be sent to France before Britain's home defense became inadequate? How many destroyers could escort Atlantic convoys before Mediterranean supply lines collapsed? How many troops could be spared for North Africa before Egypt fell? Every decision involved trading one catastrophe against another, allocating insufficient resources to multiple desperate needs. The Americans, arriving late to the war, faced no such constraints. Their industrial base was untouched by bombing, their cities unblitzed, their civilian population consuming rather than rationing. America could build ships and planes and tanks while simultaneously raising armies and maintaining domestic prosperity. This was not a criticism. Britain would have given much to have such advantages, but it was a recognition that fundamentally altered British strategic assumptions. If America could win a victory like Midway just 6 months into the war, what would American power look like in a year, in 2 years?
The psychological impact of Midway rippled through British military and political circles in ways both obvious and subtle. The obvious impact was relief. Raw, simple relief that Japan's advance had been broken, that India and Australia were safer, that the Pacific War would not become an unstoppable Japanese tide rolling toward eventual confrontation with British territories. But the subtle impact was more complex, a recalibration of Britain's place in the Allied coalition. Before Midway, Britain was the senior partner in the alliance against fascism, the experienced power guiding American newcomers. After Midway, that relationship began inverting. America was not proving to be Britain's junior partner. America was revealing itself as the dominant military-industrial power of the wartime alliance, capable of achievements in months that had taken Britain years to prepare. Churchill recognized this immediately. His reaction to Midway mixed genuine delight at the victory with astute political calculation about what it meant for post-war power arrangements. In conversations with his chiefs of staff, Churchill emphasized that Britain must maintain significant military contribution to both European and Pacific theaters, not merely to defeat the Axis, but to preserve British influence in the eventual peace. A war won primarily by American arms would produce a peace shaped by American priorities. British interests, imperial, commercial, strategic, required that Britain remain militarily relevant even as American power expanded. This created new pressures on already overstretched British forces. Plans for operations in Burma gained urgency, not just to defend India, but to demonstrate British capacity for offensive action in Asia. Commitments to the Mediterranean campaign became more critical, showing that Britain could carry weight in theaters beyond home defense. Meanwhile, in the wardrooms and officers' messes where British naval officers gathered, conversations about Midway took on analytical intensity. How exactly had the Americans achieved such disproportionate results? Reports from American sources were generous with operational details. The Americans had less institutional reluctance than British services about sharing tactical information with allies. British officers studied accounts of the attack with professional fascination. The American dive bombers arriving from 3 different squadrons, uncoordinated but coincidentally simultaneous, catching all 4 Japanese carriers with armed aircraft on their decks. The Japanese carriers destroyed within minutes of each other, transformed from floating air bases into burning wrecks by bomb hits that detonated fueled planes and exposed ordnance.
the entire decisive phase of the battle lasting perhaps 10 minutes, a quarter hour that reversed the strategic balance of the Pacific War. British carrier officers, who had developed their own aviation doctrine through painful Mediterranean experience, recognized that luck had played an enormous role at Midway. The Americans had launched their strikes at maximum range, gambling that they would find the Japanese carriers despite imprecise navigation. Torpedo squadrons had arrived first, attacking without fighter cover, and been decimated. 41 torpedo bombers launched, only 6 returned, with almost no hits achieved. It was a slaughter that could have produced nothing but American casualties. But the torpedo attacks pulled Japanese fighter cover down to wave height, leaving the sky above the carriers relatively clear when American dive bombers arrived. That timing, unplanned, uncoordinated, fortuitous, created a fleeting window that American pilots exploited brilliantly. British officers understood that battle often depended on such moments, when fortune and audacity intersected. But they also recognized that only a nation with deep reserves could afford the risk. If the American gamble at Midway had failed, if their carriers had been caught instead, the Pacific War would have extended years longer. Britain could not afford such wagers. America apparently could. This difference between fighting on narrow margins and fighting with abundance became the recurring theme in British assessments of American military performance. It manifested in countless details that British observers noted. American pilots at Midway flew aircraft that were mechanically sound, fully fueled, armed with functional torpedoes and bombs. British pilots in the Mediterranean often flew with equipment shortages, maintenance backlogs, and weapons whose reliability was uncertain. American carriers operated with damage control parties equipped with modern firefighting equipment, redundant systems, and supply reserves. British carriers, functioning in resource-scarce environments, made do with less of everything. When the Yorktown took bomb and torpedo hits at Midway, American damage control teams kept her afloat for 2 more days, nearly saving her. British carriers hit similarly in Mediterranean actions often lacked the equipment or redundancy for such recoveries. None of this diminished British respect for their own forces. The Royal Navy had fought brilliantly with limited resources for 3 years, achieving crucial victories at Toronto, Mattapan, and in the Atlantic convoy battles. But Midway illuminated a truth that British planners found both encouraging and melancholy. American abundance might be more decisive than British experience. The war would be won not merely by courage or skill, but by factories, shipyards, training programs, and logistical systems operating at scales that Britain, exhausted by 3 years of total war, could not match. This realization did not produce resentment. British leadership understood that winning the war required exactly this kind of overwhelming material advantage. But it did produce a certain wistfulness, a recognition that Britain's global preeminence was passing not because Britain had failed, but because America had grown beyond British capacity to match.
In the weeks after Midway, as intelligence analysts pieced together fuller pictures of the battle, certain details acquired symbolic weight in British discussions. One such detail was the speed of American carrier construction. At the moment of Midway, American shipyards had already laid the keels for 10 new Essex-class carriers, massive ships displacing 30,000 tons, capable of carrying 90 aircraft. These were not patrol carriers or converted merchantmen, but purpose-built fleet carriers designed to dominate naval aviation. Britain's entire carrier construction program, constrained by shipyard capacity and resources, aimed to produce a handful of new carriers by 1944. America would have 10 by 1943, with more to follow. The mathematics were staggering. British naval officers had grown up in a service that took years to build capital ships, that treated each battleship or carrier as a precious, irreplaceable asset. American production treated carriers almost as consumable goods, building them in series like trucks, planning for numbers that would provide overwhelming advantage.
Another symbolic detail was the American response to the Yorktown's damage at Coral Sea. The carrier had taken bomb hits that would have required months of shipyard work under normal procedures. American engineers at Pearl Harbor repaired her in 72 hours, working around the clock, using whatever materials were available, prioritizing speed over perfection. The Yorktown sailed to Midway still carrying temporary patches and emergency repairs. She fought effectively, and when she finally sank after absorbing additional damage, American planners did not mourn her as an irreplaceable loss. They knew 3 more carriers were already approaching operational status. This attitude that losses were temporary, that ships and planes could be replaced faster than the enemy could sink them, represented a form of strategic confidence that Britain had not enjoyed since 1940. British shipyards worked just as hard, British engineers performed equally brilliant repairs, but Britain could not replace losses at American rates. Every British carrier lost was a strategic blow. American carriers, increasingly, were components in a production system that could absorb losses and continue growing stronger. British observers also noted the American approach to pilot training. The Japanese had entered the war with superbly trained carrier pilots, veterans of years of combat in China, men who could perform aerobatic feats and demonstrate exceptional skill. But Japan's training system was narrow, producing relatively small numbers of elite pilots. When those men died, as hundreds did at Midway, Japan struggled to replace them. America's training system was vastly different. Large flight schools across the continental United States, standardized training programs, mass production of competent pilots. American pilots at Midway were less experienced than their Japanese opponents, but there were more of them, and behind them came thousands more in training. Britain operated a similar but smaller system, producing excellent pilots, but in numbers constrained by available aircraft, fuel, and instructors. America seemed unconstrained, turning flying training into an industrial process that treated pilots like products coming off an assembly line. This recurring theme, American abundance versus everyone else's scarcity, shaped British strategic thinking in the second half of 1942. If America could achieve Midway-level results while still mobilizing, what would happen when American production hit full stride? British planners knew the answer: overwhelming force. The question became how Britain could maintain relevant contribution in a war increasingly dominated by American power. Churchill's answer was to emphasize areas where British experience still mattered: intelligence, commando operations, strategic bombing planning, coordination with resistance movements. British forces must remain visibly engaged, achieving recognizable victories, maintaining the appearance of equal partnership, even as the material balance shifted decisively toward America. This required careful political management, ensuring that British contributions were prominent in Allied planning, while accepting that American resources would provide the bulk of military power. Within the Royal Navy specifically, Midway prompted extensive doctrinal analysis. British carrier aviation had evolved differently from American practice, shaped by Mediterranean constraints and different operational requirements. British carriers were smaller, more heavily armored, capable of absorbing more damage but carrying fewer aircraft. British doctrine emphasized defense and survivability. American carriers were larger, more lightly protected, carrying massive air groups designed for offensive punch. American doctrine emphasized striking first and striking hard, accepting vulnerability in exchange for hitting power. Midway seemed to validate the American approach. Superior offensive capability had destroyed the enemy before defensive considerations mattered. British naval officers debated whether this was genuinely a superior doctrine or simply a doctrine enabled by abundance. With unlimited resources, offensive doctrine worked because losses could be absorbed. Britain, fighting on narrow margins, could not afford the American style of risk-taking. But beyond doctrinal debates, Midway forced British strategic culture to confront an uncomfortable truth: that wars are won by nations that can afford to fail and try again. Britain had spent 3 years fighting without margin for error. Every campaign was a desperate throw of insufficient dice. Every defeat threatened cascading collapse. The British Expeditionary Force's escape from Dunkirk succeeded because Britain threw everything, warships, fishing boats, personal yachts, into the evacuation. If it had failed, Britain would have lost most of its trained army and might have faced invasion with inadequate forces. Britain lived at that level of existential pressure for 3 years. America, by contrast, lost most of its Pacific battleship force at Pearl Harbor and shrugged. The battleships would be replaced. Other forces would substitute. The war would continue. That psychological difference between fighting on the edge of collapse and fighting with comfortable reserves manifested in everything from tactical decisions to strategic planning. Midway demonstrated not just that America could win battles, but that America fought with confidence born of abundance. American commanders at Midway took risks that British officers might have considered reckless, launching strikes at extreme range, dividing forces, committing carriers to battle knowing Japanese forces outnumbered them. Those risks succeeded because American strikes found the enemy at the critical moment, and because American industrial power meant that even failure would not be final defeat. British commanders, shaped by 3 years of fighting with inadequate resources, learned different lessons: conserve forces, minimize risks, husband scarce assets for carefully chosen moments. Both approaches reflected the material conditions their practitioners faced. Americans could gamble because they had reserves. British had to be careful because they did not. As summer 1942 progressed and fuller intelligence on Midway circulated through Allied military channels, British analysts noted another significant detail. The American submarine force played a crucial, if inadvertent, role in the battle's aftermath. After the Japanese carriers were destroyed, American submarines shadowed the retreating Japanese fleet, attacking damaged ships and forcing the Japanese to maintain speed that exacerbated damage control problems. The Yorktown's survival for 2 days after taking damage was matched inversely by Japanese ships that might have been saved but were lost to submarine attacks while limping toward safety. This reminded British planners of a maritime dimension where American advantages were still developing: submarine warfare. America entered the war with technically advanced submarines but defective torpedoes, a problem that cost American submariners numerous successful attacks in the first year of the war. But American industry was fixing the torpedoes, training more crews, building more submarines. Britain's submarine force was excellent but small, focused on European waters. America was assembling a submarine fleet that would eventually strangle Japan's maritime logistics, cutting off the island nation from resources needed to sustain the war.
This pattern, American power still developing, still fixing early problems, but growing with inexorable momentum, became the context for all British strategic planning after Midway. The Pacific War was not won at Midway. Japan still held vast territories, still possessed powerful forces, still could inflict terrible casualties. But the trajectory had changed. Japan was now fighting defensively, reacting to American moves, trying to conserve forces that could not be replaced. America was fighting offensively, growing stronger monthly, accumulating advantages in every category of military power. British planners recognized that Pacific strategy would increasingly become an American show, with British forces playing supporting roles. The priority for British planners became ensuring that European and Mediterranean theaters, where British forces were more heavily engaged, received adequate resources and attention, even as American power in the Pacific expanded. Churchill personally used Midway in his ongoing campaign to manage the Anglo-American alliance. In communications with Roosevelt, Churchill praised the victory effusively, positioning it as a triumph for the Allied cause rather than specifically American achievement. In speeches to Parliament and the British public, Churchill emphasized Allied unity and shared purpose while carefully avoiding direct comparisons between British and American military capacity.
In strategic conferences with American leaders, Churchill argued for Mediterranean operations and peripheral strategies that played to British strengths: commando raids, coordination with local resistance, intelligence operations, rather than direct engagement where American material superiority would be most visible. Throughout, Churchill walked a careful line, maintaining British influence and prestige while accommodating the reality that America would increasingly drive Allied strategy through sheer weight of resources. For ordinary British citizens, news of Midway arrived as welcome relief in what had been an exhausting succession of bad news. The BBC reported the victory with careful phrasing that emphasized Allied cooperation and Japanese defeat rather than dwelling on American achievement. British newspapers covered the battle prominently, with maps showing Midway's strategic location and explanations of carrier warfare for readers unfamiliar with Pacific geography. The public response was generally positive: gratitude that Japan had been checked, relief that the tide seemed to be turning, satisfaction that the Axis was losing battles. But among the British public there was also an undercurrent of awareness that America's entry into the war was changing the conflict's nature. Britain had stood alone for so long that its identity had become intertwined with solitary resistance. Now Britain stood as part of a coalition where American power was becoming dominant. This was strategically necessary and ultimately welcome, but it required psychological adjustment. British troops fighting in North Africa heard about Midway through military information channels and personal letters from home. Their response was typically pragmatic: glad to hear the Japanese got bloodied, hopeful it meant fewer enemy forces to worry about, generally positive about American competence. British soldiers had not yet fought alongside American forces in large numbers. That would come later in 1942 and 1943. But Midway provided a data point suggesting the Americans could deliver when needed. British tank crews facing Rommel in the western desert, British infantry holding perimeters at Tobruk, British artillerymen calculating firing solutions against German positions, all continued their immediate battles with perhaps slightly greater optimism that the global strategic balance was shifting favorably. Midway did not change their daily reality, but it changed the mathematics of eventual victory. Among British politicians and strategic thinkers, Midway prompted reflection on post-war order. If America was demonstrating such overwhelming power in 1942, what would the post-war world look like? Britain had entered the war as one of 2 or 3 global superpowers, alongside Germany and potentially the Soviet Union. By mid-1942, it was becoming clear that the post-war world would be dominated by 2 powers, America and the Soviet Union. Britain would remain important, influential, wealthy by some standards, but no longer in the first tier of global military-industrial power. This was not a comfortable realization for a nation that had spent 3 centuries as the world's preeminent imperial power. British strategic planning began incorporating this new reality, seeking to preserve British interests and influence in a world where British power would be relatively diminished, building special relations with America to maintain relevance, and managing the gradual dissolution of formal empire into a commonwealth of independent nations. The recurring symbol through all these British reactions to Midway was the aircraft carrier itself, a weapon system that Britain had pioneered, developed through the 1920s and 1930s, and used effectively in Mediterranean combat. Britain had shown at Toronto that carriers could strike battleships in harbor, presaging Pearl Harbor. British carriers had hunted the Bismarck, supported Malta, attacked Italian naval bases. But at Midway, American carriers had achieved a scale of victory that British carriers operating with fewer aircraft and in more constrained environments had not accomplished. The carrier became symbolic of the broader pattern: British innovation and experience, American industrial application at transformative scale. Britain had taught the world how carrier aviation worked. America was demonstrating how carrier aviation could decide wars. In classified strategic assessments prepared for the War Cabinet in the months after Midway, British planners laid out the new Pacific balance in stark terms. Japan had lost qualitative superiority in carrier aviation and could not regain it. American production would provide quantitative superiority that would grow overwhelming by 1943. British forces in the Pacific and Indian Ocean theaters could contribute but not decisively affect outcomes, which would be determined by American naval power and American amphibious capabilities. British strategic interests required maintaining visible presence and achieving recognizable contributions to Pacific operations, but primary planning focus should remain in Europe and the Mediterranean, where British forces were larger and more capable of independent, significant operations. This was not defeatism, but realism, acknowledging that British power had limits and should be employed where it could have greatest effect.
Yet, even as British planners recognized American dominance in the Pacific, they also recognized something else. That shared victory in the Pacific created bonds and obligations that would shape post-war international order. Britain and America were fighting as allies, coordinating strategy, sharing intelligence, supporting each other's operations. Those patterns of cooperation would not end with Japanese surrender. They would form the foundation for post-war Western security architecture. British strategic thinkers, even while acknowledging diminished relative power, worked to ensure that Anglo-American cooperation would continue beyond the war, preserving British influence through partnership with American power. Midway thus became not just a military victory, but a political moment, evidence that the democratic powers could defeat fascism and that their cooperation would define the coming peace. As 1942 progressed and Allied planning turned toward future operations, Midway remained a reference point in strategic discussions. When debate emerged about priorities, whether to invade North Africa or launch cross-channel attacks into France, whether to emphasize strategic bombing or amphibious operations, how to allocate shipping between Atlantic and Pacific theaters, Midway served as evidence that aggressive action could produce decisive results. American planners pointed to Midway as proof that American forces, even while still building strength, could achieve major victories. British planners referenced Midway as example of what proper intelligence preparation and calculated risk-taking could accomplish. The battle entered the shared language of the Anglo-American alliance as a touchstone for what was possible when industrial power, tactical innovation, and operational courage aligned. But for British observers, the deepest lesson of Midway was not tactical or operational, it was existential. Midway revealed that the center of gravity in the democratic world had shifted westward across the Atlantic. Britain had held that center through the dark years of 1940 and 1941, maintaining civilization's resistance to fascism when resistance seemed futile. But Britain had held at such cost, exhausting reserves of wealth and strength, that it could no longer sustain the burden alone. America had arrived, massively powerful, wealthy beyond British comprehension, capable of producing armaments at rates that transformed war from a contest of skills into a contest of industrial capacity. Britain was no longer the indispensable nation, America was. This did not diminish British sacrifice or British courage. It simply recognized that wars in the industrial age are won by factories as much as by soldiers, and America's factories would bury the Axis under avalanches of ships and planes and tanks that no amount of skill or courage could overcome. In officers' clubs and government offices, in strategic planning sessions and diplomatic cables, British leaders absorbed this reality through the summer and fall of 1942.
They watched American forces land in North Africa in November, launching Operation Torch with mixed British-American forces but overwhelming American logistics. They followed American naval operations in the South Pacific, where American forces ground through the Solomon Islands in brutal attritional combat, taking casualties but always replacing losses, always coming back stronger. They monitored American production figures, carriers being launched monthly, aircraft produced by tens of thousands, tanks and trucks and artillery pieces flowing from factories in quantities that made British production look microscopic. And they understood that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The Axis could not defeat America's industrial power. The only questions were how long the war would last and what the world would look like afterward. June 7, 1942. That teletype message arriving in the Admiralty operations room. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. An impossible victory achieved by a nation that 6 months earlier had seemed vulnerable to Japanese advance. British officers reading that message understood immediately that they were witnessing a pivot point in history, not just military history, but the history of global power. The British Empire, which had dominated the world's oceans for 3 centuries, was passing the torch to a new maritime power. Not through defeat, but through transformation, as total war exposed the true metrics of national power in the industrial age. Britain would remain important, would contribute significantly to final victory, would shape the post-war order through diplomacy and alliance, but the age when Britain could stand as the world's preeminent power had ended. A new age, dominated by American industrial might and Soviet continental power, was beginning. The lieutenant commander who first read that Midway message could not have articulated all these implications, but perhaps climbing those stairs in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying news that would travel from the Admiralty to Churchill's desk by breakfast, he sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The war against Japan would continue for 3 more years, consuming millions of lives, devastating vast territories, culminating in atomic horror at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But on June 7, 1942, when news reached London that American dive bombers had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a single afternoon, the trajectory of the Pacific War was set. Japan would lose because America had resources to win. Not merely courage or skill, but resources. Ships to replace ships, planes to replace planes, pilots to replace pilots, bombs and fuel and steel in quantities limited only by how fast factories could produce them. Britain had learned through 3 years of desperate fighting what victory required in modern industrial war, more of everything than the enemy possessed. Britain had held on through those years by fighting brilliantly with insufficient resources, making every ship and plane and soldier count for maximum effect. But brilliance has limits. Resources determine outcomes. And America had resources that seemed unlimited. Not truly unlimited, but so vast that they functioned as such in the context of World War II. Midway was the first major demonstration that American resources, mobilized and projected, could achieve decisive results. It would not be the last. From Midway forward, American power grew exponentially month by month until by 1945, the United States dominated both oceans, possessed nuclear weapons, maintained the world's largest Navy and Air Force, and stood as the undisputed leading power of the non-communist world. British leaders watching this transformation felt pride. Pride that Britain had held the line until America arrived. Pride that Anglo-American cooperation was defeating fascism. Pride that democratic values were prevailing. They also felt loss of primacy, loss of the comfortable assumption that Britain would naturally lead, loss of the imperial certainty that characterized British strategic culture for generations. But above all, they felt relief. Profound, lasting relief. Because Midway meant that the democracies would win, that the sacrifices of 1940 and 1941 had not been in vain, that the future would not belong to fascism. That knowledge, carried in a teletype message on a June morning in London, was worth any amount of wounded pride or diminished status.
The stone corridors of the Admiralty had witnessed centuries of British naval history. Reports of Trafalgar and Jutland, victories and defeats spanning the age of sail through the age of steam into the age of aircraft. On June 7, 1942, those corridors witnessed the beginning of a new age, when British naval officers reading American victory dispatches understood that the Royal Navy's 3 centuries of dominance were giving way to American naval supremacy. It was a peaceful transfer of power conducted between allies, built on shared values and mutual sacrifice, but it was nonetheless a transfer, marking the end of Britain's era as global hegemon and the beginning of America's. And perhaps that morning, as sunlight finally reached the shadowed corners of Whitehall, as the day staff arrived to replace the night watch, as the war's endless administrative machinery resumed its grinding routine, perhaps there was space for a moment of honest recognition that Britain had done enough, had fought long enough, sacrificed deeply enough, held firm when holding firm mattered most, and that now, reinforced by American power, the path to victory stretched visible ahead. Midway had not won the war, but Midway had proven that the war could be won. For British leaders who had contemplated defeat as a real possibility through 1940 and 1941, that knowledge that victory was achievable, that the mathematics finally favored the democracies, was itself a kind of victory. A personal victory against despair, against the exhaustion of 3 years fighting alone, against the terrible weight of defending civilization with insufficient means. The teletype machine in the operations room continued its mechanical chatter, printing new messages, new intelligence, new demands. The war continued. But something had changed. The question was no longer whether the democracies could win, but how soon. And in that shift from existential doubt to logistical certainty, Britain found a species of peace. The long, lonely vigil was over. America had arrived not just with soldiers, but with proof, burning Japanese carriers sinking in the Pacific, that democratic industrial power, fully mobilized, was unstoppable. Britain could share the burden now, could stand alongside America rather than standing alone. It was not the future Britain had imagined in the confident days of empire, but it was a future where fascism would be defeated and democracy preserved. And that, ultimately, was what Britain had been fighting for since September 1939. 4 Japanese carriers, one impossible day, and in the Admiralty building in London, the sound of a teletype machine printing the news that the democratic world would survive. That was Midway's meaning for Britain. Not just a tactical victory in a distant ocean, but confirmation that the values Britain had defended at such cost would endure. The empire would fade, but freedom would persist. And in the terrible arithmetic of total war, that was the only calculation that finally mattered.